In the fall of 52 BC, the Roman army found itself in the most desperate situation in the entire long history of its bloody conquests. Gaius Julius Caesar led his victorious legions to the impregnable hill of Alesia, which was situated in the very heart of hostile Celtic territory. At the summit of this steep hill, 60,000 fierce Gallic warriors, led by the incredibly cunning and cruel chieftain Vercingetorix, had barricaded themselves securely. The Roman commanders had anticipated a classic protracted siege, but soon received alarming news from their distant mounted scouts. Outside, a gigantic relief army of some 240,000 enraged savage barbarians was rapidly approaching the besieged Alesia. The Roman army suddenly found itself tightly squeezed into an incredibly narrow earthen ring between two massive forces of a merciless enemy. The legionaries had to urgently construct two continuous defensive lines of fortifications at once to try to protect themselves from certain doom on both sides. One tall, powerful wall faced inward, directly toward the besieged city, while the second faced outward against the advancing massive horde. Elite, disciplined infantrymen were suddenly transformed into mere filthy diggers who had to accomplish a physically impossible amount of work in the shortest possible time. This grandiose and insane feat of engineering became a veritable, protracted nightmare in real life for every ordinary Roman soldier. It is difficult to even imagine the incredible level of constant psychological stress that weighed incessantly on the mind of every ancient warrior in the camp. An enraged and desperate enemy could attack at any moment, and the digging legionnaires had to immediately drop their tools and grab their swords. On cold nights, the damp earth literally trembled with the terrifying screams of tens of thousands of barbarians, desperately eager to spill hot Roman blood. Survival in such unbearable extreme conditions demanded not only outstanding physical endurance from every man, but also a will of steel. Welcome to the harsh and unforgiving Gaul of the 1st century BCE, where a painful death awaited the builders in literally every trench. Roman legionaries had to dig 25 miles of continuous defensive fortifications by hand in just 6 very short and rainy weeks.
God, I'm tired.
This incredible volume of grueling, heavy labor fell on the hunched shoulders of people who were incredibly exhausted, chronically hungry, and deeply frightened by the unknown. Caesar's talented military engineers designed an extremely complex system of reliable circular defenses, consisting of deep ditches, high earthen ramparts, and sturdy wooden towers. The first line of impregnable fortifications formed a tight, deadly ring around Alesia itself and stretched for 11 long miles in total. The second outer line of defense securely shielded the Roman camp from the rear and stretched continuously for 14 miles across extremely rugged terrain. The main indispensable tool of the ordinary legionary during those 1.5 endless months was a heavy double-edged iron pickaxe called a delabra. The entire proud and renowned Roman heavy infantry instantly transformed into a vast army of professional laborers with absolutely no right to a normal night's sleep. Simple, disciplined soldiers furiously pounded the hard, unyielding, stony ground from the early misty morning until the deepest, darkest night. Huge calluses on their calloused hands quickly burst from the friction, turning into open, incredibly painful, and constantly festering deep wounds. The stern centurions mercilessly and brutally drove on all the soldiers who lagged behind physically, fully aware of the mortal danger of even the slightest delay in this massive construction project. The changeable autumn weather in Wild Gaul brought constant cold, torrential rains, and a very sharp, icy, piercing wind to the besiegers' camp. The deep trenches recently dug by the Romans filled incredibly quickly with icy, viscous, and completely opaque muddy rainwater mixed with clay. The Roman diggers constantly had to stand knee-deep in liquid brown sludge for hours on end, laboriously throwing heavy clods of earth upward. The sticky, cold mud clung tightly to their iron tools and soaked woolen clothing, multiplying the weight of every kilogram lifted upward many times over. dry, relatively clean, warm cloth very quickly became a completely unattainable luxury for every ordinary inhabitant of this vast military camp. The large-scale construction of the massive double wooden wall constantly demanded the strictest and most precise coordination of all the Roman army units involved. A significant portion of the exhausted legionnaires dug relentlessly at an incredibly deep trench 20 feet wide, with absolutely sheer, slippery earthen banks. Engineers had deliberately filled this first outer defensive ditch with icy water, diverted from a nearby turbulent river, to slow the enemy's advance as much as possible. Immediately behind this water barrier stood a massive, towering earthen rampart, further reinforced with sharp wooden stakes and sturdy wicker shields. Every tiny detail of this gigantic and complex defensive structure was created exclusively by the calloused hands of these endlessly weary and exhausted men, worn down by hard labor. Procuring the necessary timber became a separate and incredibly dangerous ordeal for special detachments of Roman armed lumberjacks in the surrounding thickets. Soldiers had to venture far from the secure camp under construction into the dark and dense Gallic forests every day to fell thousands of sturdy trees. Each heavy log that was felled had to be dragged on their own chafed shoulders for several miles along muddy, rutted autumn roads. During these arduous forays for timber, the Romans were regularly subjected to sudden, deadly attacks by Gallic partisans hiding in the woods. The fear of being struck by a well-aimed enemy arrow in the back while cutting down a tree haunted every legionary throughout the entire 6 weeks. Constant nervous strain and a catastrophic lack of proper sleep slowly but surely eroded the mental health of even the most hardened veterans. Many young legionaries literally collapsed into deep, dug-out trenches from complete physical exhaustion right in the middle of a long, hard workday. The wooden watchtowers were erected approximately 80 feet apart along the entire incredibly long line of walls. The construction of each such tall structure required a huge amount of carefully processed timber and incredibly heavy manual labor. The legionnaires had to hoist massive, unseasoned logs to great heights without the use of sophisticated and reliable construction hoists. The slightest mistake by a weary man while erecting the tower's framework could lead to the instant collapse of the entire heavy wooden structure onto the builders' heads. Standing at the very top of these rickety structures, sentries scanned the pitch-black darkness every night, waiting for the sudden appearance of the enemy army. With each passing day of the siege, the pace of construction had to increase, despite the catastrophic decline in the physical strength of the ordinary soldiers. Julius Caesar personally rode around the defensive fortifications under construction on his horse, sternly inspecting the quality of every meter of the deep trench that had been dug. There was absolutely nowhere to flee from this enclosed space, as an army of thousands of enraged Celtic tribes was already waiting for them outside. The feeling of complete isolation from the rest of the outside world weighed like a heavy leaden burden on the weary souls of these simple Italian peasants and townspeople. The Roman camp had turned into a self-contained fortified island in the midst of a raging ocean of savage barbarian hatred, thirsting for immediate bloody retribution. By the end of the 6th week of large-scale construction, the landscape around the hill of Alesia had changed beyond all recognition. The green, picturesque meadows and dense forests had turned into a desecrated, dug-up wasteland, bristling with thousands of sharpened wooden stakes and deep pits. This monumental construction project has forever entered the world's military history textbooks as the greatest example of ancient defensive field engineering. However, for the soldiers who trampled this cold mud with their own feet, it was a time of unbearable physical and moral suffering. Surviving the construction of this ingenious trap proved no easier than surviving the massive and bloody final battle itself. Two high wooden walls and deep earthen ditches were categorically insufficient for reliable protection against the superior forces of a fierce enemy. The brilliant Roman commander ordered his exhausted legionnaires to litter all approaches to the camp with thousands of skillfully hidden deadly earthen traps. This complex series of deadly obstacles turned the area surrounding the camp into a veritable meat grinder for any enemy advancing in the darkness. The work of creating these hidden killing mechanisms required incredible precision and constant attention from the soldiers, who were on the verge of collapse. Every hole dug and every sharpened wooden stake was meant to be an unpleasant and lethal surprise for a fleeing barbarian. The first line of these hidden traps was given the poetic yet grimly ironic nickname lilies by the soldiers because of their shape. The legionnaires dug hundreds of smooth, round pits about 3 feet deep, arranging them in a strict checkerboard pattern in front of their fortifications. In the center of each such earthen pit, they drove a thick wooden stake, previously charred over a fire for maximum strength and hardness. The tip of this log barely protruded above ground level, remaining completely invisible to an enemy warrior running in the dark. From above, the soldiers carefully camouflaged these deadly pits with thin branches, dry autumn grass, and fallen, withered leaves. Installing the iron spikes required particular caution from the Roman soldiers, as a single misstep could result in serious injury. The blacksmiths in the camp worked around the clock, forging thousands of these sharp steel spikes under conditions of severe shortages of high-quality coal and time. The legionnaires cautiously drove the heavy stakes into the cold ground, taking care not to trip over the protruding iron points with their leather sandals. In the constant autumn rain, the metal quickly became coated with slippery mud, making the process of setting these traps an even more dangerous undertaking. An accidental fall onto one's own spikes guaranteed a Roman soldier a slow death from blood poisoning in an overcrowded, filthy infirmary. Closest to the wooden walls was the third and densest line of defensive traps, known as sharp spikes. Soldiers cut down entire groves of young, sturdy trees, sharpening their numerous thick branches into incredibly sharp wooden spikes. These horned trunks were firmly dug into deep trenches, their stiff branches tightly intertwined to form a solid wooden wall. It was physically impossible to squeeze through these sharp, prickly thickets without risking dozens of deep stab and laceration wounds. This dead wooden thicket served as the final insurmountable barrier before a deep moat filled with icy water from the local muddy river. The creation of this highly complex, multi-tiered obstacle course had not only important tactical but also immense psychological significance for the army. The legionnaires saw with their own eyes just how deadly every square meter of land outside their secure defensive camp had become. This knowledge gave them a fragile illusion of relative safety in the face of vastly superior forces of a cruel and incredibly ferocious enemy. However, this very same strip of ingenious traps turned the Roman camp into a veritable prison from which it was impossible to escape quickly. If the outer defensive wall had fallen under the onslaught of the Gauls, the retreating Romans would have had to make their way through their own barriers. The sight and smell of these killing fields remained in the memories of the surviving veterans until the end of their incredibly long and hard lives. Rotting human flesh, mixed with autumn mud and caked blood, created an unbearable stench around the entire perimeter of the Roman camp. Removing the corpses of enemies from deep pits was incredibly hard and repulsive physical labor, causing bouts of severe nausea among the soldiers. The traps of Alesia proved their ingenious reliability, but turned the surrounding landscape into a veritable branch of the gloomy underworld on Earth. Surviving alongside this concentrated horror for a month and a half was a true test of the limits of human sanity. As the massive siege dragged on, the logistics system of the vast Roman army began to suffer serious and very alarming supply disruptions. Huge supply trains carrying high-quality grain could no longer safely reach the hill of Alesia due to constant attacks by Gallic guerrilla units. The hearty wheat that every Roman legionary was accustomed to ran out very quickly, forcing the quartermasters to switch to using reserve food supplies. Soldiers began to be issued hard-feed barley, which was traditionally used in the Roman army exclusively to feed pack mules and horses. Being fed animal fodder was considered a shameful disciplinary punishment in the legions, but now it had become the only way to simply avoid starving to death. The process of cooking hard, unhulled barley turned into a daily culinary ordeal for every weary Roman soldier. The grains were so hard that they had to be boiled for hours in dirty field pots over a low fire fueled by damp wood. Grinding this barley with hand-operated stone millstones was incredibly difficult, as the exhausted men simply lacked the physical strength. The resulting coarse porridge scratched their sore throats, caused severe stomach cramps, and provided virtually no sense of the long-awaited fullness. The soldiers chewed this tasteless grey mass gloomily, fully aware that tomorrow their ration would be even smaller and even worse. Normally, Roman armies actively practiced foraging, gathering fresh food from surrounding enemy farms and fields during long campaigns. However, at Alesia, the legionaries found themselves locked inside their own gigantic wooden cage, with no possibility whatsoever of venturing out for supplies. The surrounding forests and fields were teeming with aggressive Gallic scouts, ready to instantly slit the throat of any Roman soldier who dared to venture far. Gathering edible herbs, berries, or hunting game under such conditions was tantamount to a sophisticated and very rapid form of suicide. Caesar's army was forced to slowly consume itself, sinking deeper into the abyss of absolute food despair with each passing day. Attempts to diversify their meager rations sometimes led to tragic and utterly fatal consequences for inexperienced soldiers in the camp. Some desperate legionnaires tried to cook a stew out of old leather belts and scraps of horse tack to at least somewhat deceive their empty stomachs. Others secretly caught the huge camp rats that had proliferated in abundance in the deep cesspools near the soldiers' tents. Eating these carriers of dangerous infections caused instant outbreaks of deadly fevers that wiped out entire tent sections. Hunger drove people to the most extreme and insane measures, completely erasing the thin line between a civilized human and a wild animal. Chronic malnutrition critically reduced the soldiers' ability to perform heavy physical labor on the construction of endless defensive fortifications. People quickly became winded at the slightest exertion. Their weakened muscles could not even lift a light basket of dug-up wet earth. The wooden handles of their pickaxes slipped from their trembling hands, and dark, blurry spots often danced before their inflamed eyes from constant dizziness. Commanders had to drastically lower production quotas, as it was simply impossible to force these half-dead men to work faster. The Roman war machine, accustomed to sweeping everything in its path, now moved its own exhausted legs with great difficulty. When you read about Caesar's great victory, just remember these nameless men with empty, growling stomachs. They won one of the most important battles in the history of the ancient world, while teetering on the brink of starvation-induced fainting in the cold mud. The taste of hard, raw barley and rancid lard became for them the true and unforgettable taste of the great Roman triumph. To survive on such a repulsive diet for a month and a half of grueling physical exertion was a true miracle of human biological endurance. This invisible culinary war claimed the lives of many Romans whose names were never recorded in the official historical chronicles of victory. 40,000 filthy adult men, confined to a limited space for 6 weeks, inevitably created a veritable sanitary disaster. The main source of fresh drinking water for the entire massive Roman camp was a small, fast-flowing local river running through the valley. However, due to the immense density of troops and the inability to leave the camp, the legionnaires were forced to dig latrines too close to the water. Regular heavy autumn rains quickly overflowed these shallow, foul-smelling latrines, washing hundreds of gallons of human waste directly into the riverbed. Literally within a few weeks of the siege, the clear, transparent stream turned into a murky brown sludge, bringing death to anyone who drank from it. Aware of the deadly danger of this filthy water, the soldiers tried to boil it over campfires, but a catastrophic shortage of dry firewood made this impossible. Fire was reserved exclusively for cooking hard barley and warming people soaked to the bone during the cold, rainy Gallic nights. The meager ancient medicine was utterly powerless in the face of this massive and rapidly spreading gastrointestinal catastrophe in the camp. Regimental doctors could offer the sick soldiers only weak decoctions of local herbs, which did absolutely nothing to stop the disease. The only dubious remedy was considered to be complete starvation, which, under conditions of already severe exhaustion, only hastened the death of the unfortunate legionnaire. Infected people were often simply left lying on the cold ground in their own filth, as there was no one to care for them. Healthy soldiers were afraid to approach their sick comrades out of a primal fear of contracting this shameful and agonizing stomach infection. Constant dampness and pervasive filth created ideal conditions for the massive proliferation of all manner of parasites and harmful insects. Huge swarms of fat flies buzzed over open cesspools, carrying dangerous bacteria directly onto the meager rations of Roman soldiers. Field surgeons had to perform dozens of brutal amputations of festering limbs every day, with absolutely no effective pain relief. The agonized screams of those undergoing surgery mingled with the sound of torrential rain and the creaking of heavy wooden carts, creating a symphony of pure suffering. Mortality rates in the overcrowded, stifling medical tents reached terrifying levels, turning them into peculiar waiting rooms for inevitable death. People had grown accustomed to the unbearable stench of one another, merging into a single filthy, foul-smelling, and embittered grey mass. Water, which was meant to bring life and purification, had turned into a merciless and invisible reaper with a scythe. Gazing at the murky waters of the local river, the soldiers understood the bitter irony of their current catastrophic and hopeless situation. They themselves had polluted the source of their life, and now nature was taking cruel revenge on them for this interference with terrifying diseases. There was simply no alternative, as thirst always proved stronger than the fear of an invisible stomach infection and a shameful death. Every legionnaire knew full well that the next sip of this foul-smelling sludge could be his very last in this life. Surviving in such an epidemiological hell without antibiotics or clean water was a true test of the human immune system's resilience. The siege of Alesia went down in history as a triumph of Roman engineering, but it also became a triumph of human filth and sewage. This grandiose construction project required not only enormous effort, but also the abandonment of any semblance of civilized human existence. Caesar's legionaries, who had conquered half the known world, proved powerless in the face of common diarrhea and contaminated, dirty river water. If the barbarians outside had held out for just a few more weeks, perhaps they would not have had to fight against the living and healthy Romans. An epidemic within the walls could have done the work for them, leaving on the hill only a huge, filthy crypt of decaying corpses. At the center of a common legionnaire's meager and filthy existence was his tent, which the Romans officially called a contubernium. 8 dirty adult men were forced to huddle constantly in this incredibly cramped leather shelter, designed for minimal comfort. The tent was sewn from thick, untreated calfskin hides, which, in the damp Gallic weather, began to emit a sharp and very unpleasant sour smell. In a space of just 10 square feet, the soldiers had to sleep, repair their worn-out equipment, and take shelter from the endless torrential rain. It was a completely enclosed, claustrophobic space where the very concept of personal privacy was absent as a fact of human life. When 8 men, soaked to the skin, crawled inside after a grueling shift of many hours in the mud, the air instantly became heavy. The smell of unwashed, sweaty bodies mingled with the stench of wet wool, rancid lard from mess tins, and the damp animal hide of the tent itself. Breathing in this stifling atmosphere was incredibly difficult, especially at night, when the thick canopy was tightly closed to retain heat. Due to the complete lack of proper ventilation, thick condensation from the warm breath of 8 people constantly accumulated inside the contubernium. Drops of this foul-smelling moisture fell continuously from the leather ceiling directly onto the faces and dirty clothes of the legionnaires sleeping on the ground. Together they shared the meager remnants of rancid lard, bandaged each other's bleeding, festering wounds, and covered each other's backs in bloody combat. The death of one of the contubernium's members was perceived as a heavy personal tragedy, leaving a gaping void in this cramped and filthy collective. An inexperienced recruit was often sent to replace the fallen veteran, and he had to prove his right to sleep alongside these harsh men all over again. The noise inside the huge military camp never completely died down, penetrating the thin leather walls of the tent both during the day and late at night. The shouts of strict overseers, the clang of heavy blacksmiths' hammers, the braying of hungry mules, and the moans of dying wounded men created a constant, oppressive background. This incessant hum did not allow the mind to relax for a single second, constantly reminding one of the deadly threat hanging over the camp. The soldiers learned to sleep with one eye open, reacting automatically only to the specific sounds of military bugles announcing the start of an enemy attack. This state of constant heightened anxiety wore down the nervous system far more than the hardest, hours-long physical labor with a shovel. Staying in the contubernium became especially unbearable during brief but severe outbreaks of various infectious intestinal diseases. If one of the 8 men fell ill with severe dysentery, the entire cramped tent instantly turned into a foul-smelling and dangerous quarantine zone. Healthy legionnaires had to breathe the contaminated air and sleep in close proximity to the suffering patient with no way to leave. The fear of infection spread through the air, causing soldiers to listen suspiciously to every cough from their neighbor in the filthy bed. This invisible internal threat was far more terrifying than an open enemy, as it could not be defended against with a sturdy wooden shield. Every new morning in this cramped leather hell began with the sharp, piercing sound of a Roman camp horn. Exhausted men struggled to drag their aching bodies off the damp ground, pulling cold, wet woolen clothes over themselves. They silently emerged from the stifling tent into the grey mist, preparing for yet another endless day of hard labor or bloody slaughter. The sight of this shabby leather structure evoked in them a deep-seated sense of hatred, mixed with a strange, animal-like relief. No matter how terrible it was inside, it was their only tiny refuge in this vast, utterly hostile and cruel world. No modern person could have spent even a single day in the conditions of a classic Roman contubernium during the massive siege of Alesia. This life demanded a complete and unconditional renunciation of one's own ego and any notions of basic human comfort. The Roman war machine chewed up the personalities of its soldiers, turning them into faceless and utterly obedient cogs in a vast, bloody machine. 8 men merged into a single organism capable of surviving and killing effectively under the most unbearable, unsanitary field conditions. The smell of that filthy leather tent remained forever in their memory as the primary and most powerful scent of the great Roman conquest. The physical hardships of the siege were terrible, but the constant psychological pressure destroyed human souls far more effectively and much more quickly. Every ordinary legionary was fully aware of his mathematical doom, trapped between 2 enormous and incredibly aggressive barbarian armies. The knowledge that 240,000 enraged Gauls were marching purposefully toward Alesia right behind you drove people mad. This anticipation of an inevitable bloody massacre was like slow torture, as if the executioner were deliberately sharpening his axe for a long time in front of the victim. The soldiers constantly scanned the horizon, trying to make out the first ranks of the massive approaching army of merciless salvation through the autumn fog. During the day, the Romans could watch from their watchtowers as the defenders of the Gallic fortress inside the ring slowly starved to death. The sight of emaciated women and crying children wandering along the Roman fortifications in search of food evoked mixed and very heavy feelings. On the one hand, these were mortal enemies whose husbands and fathers had been killing Roman legionaries in the forests of Gaul for years. On the other hand, the sight of infants dying of starvation pierced the armor of indifference even of the most hardened and brutal military veterans. This moral dissonance tormented the soldiers' souls, forcing them to doubt the rightness and justice of this endless, brutal war of conquest. The constant, biting autumn cold played a significant role in the psychological breakdown of every Roman infantryman in the trenches. When a person is constantly freezing and has no way to warm up properly, their thoughts naturally narrow to basic survival. The legionnaires simply had no inner moral strength left to show compassion or friendly support toward one another. Everyone thought only of how to survive until the next shift and get their meager portion of disgusting barley porridge. The cold froze out everything human in people, leaving only an empty and very angry shell, ready to kill instinctively for the sake of survival. Some soldiers simply could not withstand this weeks-long pressure and broke down psychologically even before the main decisive assault began. They began talking loudly to themselves, refused to eat, or fell into a state of absolute and profound apathy. Such broken men were quietly reassigned to the dirtiest, most menial labor, where they were not required to carry combat weapons. Their empty, glassy stares served as a constant and terrifying reminder to everyone else of just how fragile the healthy human psyche is. War in antiquity was not only a contest of physical strength, but also the most brutal test of the endurance of the human mind and will. The pressure from the brutal centurions was constant and utterly merciless toward any signs of physical weakness or fatigue. These harsh veterans, with vine-twig canes in their hands, were tasked with beating any thoughts of retreat out of the recruits. Their shouts and beatings created an atmosphere of constant, clinging fear of punishment, which was meant to drown out the fear of barbarian swords. A legionnaire was supposed to fear his commander more than even the largest and most fearsome Gaul with a battle axe in his hand. This harsh system of control was the only way to force them to stand their ground to the death in the face of utterly obvious hopelessness. The siege of Alesia was an incredibly cruel psychological experiment on tens of thousands of living people, locked inside a double wooden ring. This experience left deep, unhealing scars on the souls of all the surviving legionnaires, turning them into cynical and utterly ruthless killers. They realized that human life is worth absolutely nothing, and that only those capable of plunging a sword into an enemy's throat faster than others survive. The psychology of the siege stripped them of all illusions about the nobility of war, exposing its true, filthy, and incredibly bloody essence. When the Gallic relief army finally appeared on the horizon, the Romans greeted it not with heroic trepidation, but with deep and gloomy despair. Long weeks of agonizing anticipation and fear came to a bloody end when a gigantic Gaulish army appeared on the horizon. Darkness had not yet fully descended upon the valley, yet the air was already filled with the deafening roar of hundreds of thousands of throats and the sounds of war horns. The barbarians had decided to launch their decisive, crushing blow deep into the night, counting on the element of surprise and their numerical superiority in the darkness. The Roman legionaries took their positions on the wooden walls, gripping the hilts of their pylons tightly with hands damp with cold sweat. The soldiers' hearts pounded wildly in their chests as they peered into the pitch-black darkness, trying to make out the approaching silhouettes of their enemies. As soon as the attack began, the entire carefully prepared strip of Roman traps instantly demonstrated its terrifyingly deadly effectiveness. The front ranks of the charging Gauls plunged headlong into the camouflaged lilies, impaling their bodies on the sharp, burnt wooden stakes at the bottom. Their piercing screams of savage pain mingled with battle cries, creating an unbearable cacophony of sound that made the Romans' ears ring. In the darkness, the rear ranks of barbarians advanced directly over the bodies of their fallen comrades, trying to break through this incredible minefield. The earth literally groaned under the weight of the hot blood spilled, turning the autumn mud into a viscous, slippery, and incredibly foul-smelling red sludge. The fear that the wooden wall was about to collapse under the immense weight of thousands of scaling barbarians was paralyzing. The wooden supports creaked menacingly under the unbearable pressure of the living human mass, ready at any moment to crash down on the heads of the defending Romans. If this had happened at night, the legionaries would have been torn to pieces with bare hands before the first saving dawn even broke. Caesar simply would not have had time to deploy his reserves in the dark, and the entire gigantic line of defense would have crumbled like a fragile house of cards. This clinging animal fear drove the soldiers to desperately hack at the arms of the Gauls clinging to the edge of the parapet, paying no heed to their own pain. At the critical moment of the night battle, Julius Caesar himself, in his famous red cloak, arrived at the most dangerous section of the defense. The appearance of the renowned commander breathed new life into the desperate soldiers, who were already preparing to accept their inevitable death on the cursed wooden walls. The sight of the man who had led them into this hell reminded them of Roman pride and the iron discipline of the legions. They closed ranks and drove the enemy back into the ditch, littering the ground with hundreds of fresh, hacked-to-pieces corpses of savage Celtic warriors. The commander's presence on the front lines had always been the most effective remedy for panic in the brutal warfare of antiquity. Blood and cold mud had mixed so thoroughly on the wooden planks of the towers that it was practically impossible to stand. The legionaries fell to their knees, continuing to fend off the pressing enemies from below with short sword thrusts straight through the slats in the wooden floor. For the ordinary Roman soldier, this dawn brought no joy of victory, but only utter physical and profound moral devastation. They stood knee-deep in the blood of their enemies and comrades, leaning on their jagged swords, unable even to utter a victory cry. The night had stripped them of their last shreds of humanity, turning these men into living ghosts with empty and incredibly terrifying eyes. To survive that night's attack at Alesia meant being reborn, but as a completely different person, utterly broken and mercilessly cruel. The horror of that night remained with them forever, returning in their worst nightmares until the end of their incredibly long lives. The famous siege of Alesia ended in a complete victory for the Roman forces when the broken Vercingetorix voluntarily surrendered to Julius Caesar. However, for the ordinary legionaries standing in the ranks, this victory had the distinct taste of rancid lard, human blood, and dirty river water. Their exhausted bodies were covered with festering sores from lice bites, bleeding blisters, and rough scars from Gallic iron swords. Many of those who survived those long 6 weeks in the mud were left disabled with severe chronic diseases of the joints and lungs. The great Roman Empire was built precisely on these broken bones and ruined lives of utterly unknown, ordinary soldier laborers. Historical treatises usually extol the brilliant strategy of the generals, carefully glossing over the incredibly filthy and repulsive physical reality of ancient field warfare. No textbook will ever be able to convey the suffocating stench that hung over the huge, overcrowded camp for 6 long weeks. Feel that metallic taste of blood on your lips and the sticky animal fear that paralyzes your entire body in the face of a vast horde of screaming barbarians. This harsh, dirty, and incredibly brutal reality is the true face of all human world history, hidden behind the pages of dry textbooks. And this reality was so terrifying that no sane person would ever want to return to it of their own free will.